To be moving you, so you're kind of comfortable where you are. You're a bit dispersed, but sure, we'll manage. Yeah, everyone can see and hear and everything. Okay, I'm Fergal, Landy. Nice to meet you. I'm a social worker, I suppose, who worked in HSE Children and Families originally, going back with homeless adolescents. Then I worked in generic child protection social work in Galway. Then I worked as a community. I suppose I became interested in prevention and early intervention. Worked for 2 years as a community development worker in Tipperary. And then I worked for 5 years in the Child and Family Research Centre, where Anne was a colleague, quite up recently. Anne was a colleague of mine as a researcher doing evaluation of predominantly multi-agency family support type initiatives. And then more recently, in the last 2 years or so, 2.5 years, we did service design and development work with the newly formed TUSLA Child and Family Agency in relation to their early help type systems as well, informed by the evaluation we had done before that, which has led to a new programme of work within TUSLA, which we'll talk about a bit today. But since September, I now work for TUSLA. I'm back, I suppose, where I started in practice, so I'm working with TUSLA and no longer with the Child and Family Research Centre. But Anne is still with the Child and Family Research Centre and involved in the research there, which she's going to speak a bit about today. Our colleague, Caroline McGregor, who usually co-present this with us, couldn't make it today, so we give her apologies. And she would speak to an expert in relation to the history of child welfare in Ireland. So we have a bit about that in the presentation, but don't ask us any difficult questions because that was Caroline's baby. But we'll still speak to it as much as we can. Do you want to just, at the beginning, say a bit about yourself as well, Anne?
Sorry, it came off. Sorry, I'll just stick it back on. No, I'll hold it there for the minute. So my name is Anne Cassidy, Dr. Anne Cassidy. I'm with the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre in NUI Galway. And I'm the lead researcher on the evaluation and research programme that we're carrying out, and particularly around MEHL. And I'll talk about that later on. So I've, I suppose, taken over from Fergal and providing technical support from within the Child and Family Research Centre and also doing the research element. And I'll talk more about that later.
Okay. And what we'd hope to do is deliver this presentation, but allow a good bit of time at the end for some discussion as well, and we're very interested from hearing from you guys as well. Okay, so the title, and this presentation is being developed as a paper that we're going to submit for publication as well, is Interfacing Informal and Formal Help Systems, a critical overview of developments within child welfare systems. So we as a trio, myself, Anne and Caroline, are interested in the interface issues, taking a kind of systems-based approach between these different help systems. And obviously, like a lot of Western developed countries now, we have a formal child protection system, but we also have a legacy from our history around, I suppose, to a certain extent, a church-influenced approach to early intervention and family support and things like that as well, which now needs to be resituated within a more contemporary understanding of early help systems. So moving it along. The aim of the paper is to document and critique the development and evolution of family support structures, processes and practices as early help systems in Ireland, with a particular emphasis on the interaction between informal and more formal statutory structures, processes and practices, which we would see as a particular issue here in Ireland, but also as having a resonance internationally as well. To consider how MEHL, and we'll explain what MEHL is for those who don't know, and associated developments can best be developed in a way that achieves necessary standardization and functionality interface without leading to a quest for homogenization on the other. So there is this tension, and I'm seeing it now in my role on a daily basis, of a desire, particularly from the political system and from the government, for standardization. But I would say it isn't only from that. I would say from a human rights-based approach as well, children are entitled to a certain standard in relation to the types of services, and their parents are entitled to a certain standard. So that brings with it standardization. I know a lot of people resist that as a kind of restriction of their autonomy, and there is an acknowledged tension there, and that's something we're interested in, I suppose. So good standardization or bad standardization, or the parameters of standardization, and within that the opportunities for local responsivity to need, and indeed creativity and practitioner-led responses as well. In other words, quite simply and very briefly put, not quite, but we want you to be reminded of the fact that child welfare in Ireland has always had elements of formal and informal support systems, working in parallel to different levels and orientations. And that's the bit that Caroline was going to speak about. I'm not saying we can't speak about it, but me and Anne wouldn't be so expert in that. And we want to take time to consider what ingredients have worked to maximise the potential for formal and informal systems to be harnessed. And that really rests on some of the more recent evaluation work that I've been involved with, which we'll speak about, and how we can help to maintain the balance between standardisation and homogenisation in the development of MEHL, which we'll explain, and the PPFS, sorry for the acronyms, but that stands for Prevention, Partnership and Family Support, which is the name of this programme of work, which I was involved in developing with others in NUI Galway, and now involved in implementing within the statutory body responsible for child protection and welfare. And we want to remind ourselves that this is not a neutral, but rather a politically charged process that requires thoughtful, intelligent, critical and reflective engagement, I suppose. So we're bucking a bit against, as we have over the last few years, facile or simplistic explanations of some of this, and acknowledging that it plays out within. Let's not kid ourselves that every decision about the development of policy in relation to children and families is somehow pure and empirically based. It occurs within a political context. I think we've observed a lot of that in Ireland over the last decade, where often decisions in this space are made in a reactionary way by the political system to specific events, often what are characterised in the media as scandals. I suppose we query that word as well, but adverse events or whatever you want to describe. And often there's a flurry of activity in the aftermath of those types of events, which isn't really thoughtful development of services in some way. It's arguably quite reactionary. This is the historical piece, I suppose, that Caroline was going to speak about. That the top right is Archbishop John Charles McQuaid. I think the one on the left is just an image from kind of, I suppose, famine times in Ireland. The bottom left is an image from the kind of industrial schools, and the bottom right is an image associated with the kind of informal process, really, I suppose you'd call it informal fostering, that used to happen in Ireland many years ago, where often extended family or friends would solve the kind of problems that the formal system now deals with at the moment. Our current president, he often makes reference to it, Michael D. Higgins, grew up in a very poor context in rural County Clare and was sent, basically raised by his aunt and uncle rather than his own parents, because his own parents were considered too poor to look after him. Obviously, a lot of those kinds of things have discontinued, but I suppose the tentative argument we're making is, in some of those, there was merit or there was value in informal systems from a community development perspective, helping to support families within a wider structure. And that there was also negative things like, I suppose, as we know from the history of industrial schools, where children were removed from those informal structures quite abruptly and in quite an authoritarian fashion through a collaboration between church and state, and many had very adverse outcomes, including sexual abuse. So the challenge in the more modern times is, how do we take the good from the legacy around actually a heritage around informal support systems and fuse that with the reality that we have international human rights obligations towards children and their parents to provide a statutory system that responds to them, and try, as it were, get the best of both worlds without being facile about it as well, which I'm critiquing. So continuity of complex relationships. In child welfare, we always have had an interplay of formal and informal systems, and there has always been tensions going back into our history. Brief overview. Again, this is what Caroline would have done, and she's written, if you just Google her, she's written a lot of articles about the history of child welfare in Ireland. But from the 1970s onwards, so after all of that church and state thing, you had the Task Force on Childcare in 1980, Task Force on Child and Family Support Agency, right up to recently in 2012. Within the voluntary sector, you have social services development, community-based help giving expanded, the deinstitutionalisation of church services. Social work as a discourse has had a contradictory and tense relationship between formal professional service and a more continuity engaged one. You know, it's interesting now that a lot of the organisations I'm involved with dealing with now who provide services on behalf of TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, a certain amount of them would have been, or still are even, their formal patron is the bishop. They still are a continuity of the church heritage that we've had, providing very comprehensive social services, often from the cradle to the grave, as they would see it, not pigeonholed into the kind of care silos that the statutory system has gone down. Often they work in communities with very young children right through to the elderly, providing meals and wheels and so on. Some of the youth work organisations are still organised on a diocesan basis because they were and still are, and maybe the bishop would be the chair of their board and so on. So the modern statutory system, as established from 1970 onwards, has moved from an orientation that was a reactive, mostly protection-orientated system to our present construction within a broader parenting, prevention and family support emphasis. Arguably, and people can critique that. So, the broad thrust of the argument is that, particularly in the 1990s in Ireland, when we had our first kind of major legislative change in the form of the Childcare Act, that said different things, but one key thing it said was that in Section 3 that there was a duty to promote the welfare of children who were not in receipt of adequate care and protection, which I think that language is really important. So when I worked as a social worker, there was certainly a tailoring of the duties of the HSE Children and Families section within the HSE, that we were responsible for working with children who were not receiving adequate care and protection. There was often kind of a struggle within that between different personnel in the organisation as to how proactive or how preventative we should be under that piece of legislation. But interestingly, the Child and Family Agency Act that establishes TUSLA now as a separate entity from the Health Services Executive imposes a positive duty on TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, to promote the development, welfare and protection of all families. So it's a much less tailored statutory responsibility. How that will play out and what capacity TUSLA have to do that, quite broad-ranging responsibility, I suppose, is another kettle of fish. But one thing that's happening is the development of this Prevention, Partnership and Family Support Programme of work. But that's coming, that's coming from the outside to a degree as well, in that it is a philanthropically funded programme of work, attempting to influence the direction of TUSLA. Okay, we must be getting nearly to a bit where you come in. How can we? This is the summing up question. How can we carry through constructive continuities from a family support history in Ireland that has always relied on a complex interplay between informal and formal? And how can we make a clear discontinuity with aspects of the formal system in Ireland that allowed for abuse of power, lack of respect for the informal, imposition of deserving and undeserving judgments to create a climate of trust, to enable this discursive ideal of harmony between statutory, voluntary and community and general public have the possibility for finding real expressions in practice contexts? Caroline must have wrote that question. It's a very long question. We'll blame Caroline for the length of that question. But, how do we... I think sometimes there's often a facile retrospective analysis put on the history in this country of abuse that it was the church, when in fact, if you look at it, it was a very neat collaboration between church and state. The church couldn't have some of the abuses that occurred can't be put down solely to the role of the church in Ireland, because the state, through the courts and through government departments, were complicit in that, in my view anyway. Well, not just in my view, the reports kind of show that. So the role of inspectors of these institutions, they were state-employed inspectors, the role of the courts in granting orders for children to be removed from home and placed in these institutions. So we shouldn't presume that just because we've had a kind of secularism and a breaking with the history of the church role in the delivery of these services, that everything's going to be honky-dory from here on in. There is still, in our view, the risk of abuse of power, of not capitalising on informal support networks and so on. Okay. I think we have two more slides with me. This is just to tell you a bit about the recent history that has informed, and again, apologies for acronyms, but we'll explain them all. There was an initiative which I was involved in evaluating called the Sligo Identification of Need, abbreviated as ION, and another one called the Limerick Assessment of Needs System, LANS. And really, the findings of the evaluation of these two initiatives informed this current programme of work that we're referring to as the Prevention, Partnership and Family Support Programme of Work. And it really, for those maybe who have a bit of knowledge of the UK context, it borrowed a bit from the CAF in the UK, the Common Assessment Framework, to develop, for the first time in Ireland, even though it was well established in the UK at this point, a common understanding of children's developmental needs, a common method of identifying them, and a common process for meeting them. So up until now, everybody had different assessment frameworks or no assessment framework. Everybody had different processes for intervening with a family, and generally speaking, I don't want to do a disservice to pockets of really good collaboration and multi-agency working, but there was no enabling system for that. If it did occur, it was kind of a coincidence that people made a decision to get on and to work together. There was no enabling system for that. And often what you did have, in my experience, and I think it's borne out by a lot of people's experience, is people working separately in silos with families. And often families literally getting a series of home visits from maybe a public health nurse, a family support worker, a social worker, whoever it is, as it was put to me once, wearing a path up and down to their door, but working completely separately, with different consequences to that. I mean, the risk-based consequence is a lack of information sharing to maybe illuminate a pattern in relation to neglect or whatever it might be. Another consequence of that is the family having to constantly retell their story and becoming disillusioned and disenchanted with the support services they were being given. And I think I had a third one there in mind. Has anyone got one from the floor? No? There's probably an endless list of consequences of people working separately. Both of these models utilise this idea of a lead practitioner approach. So you'd actually get one of those different people wearing up and down the path to the door, become a lead practitioner and pull the others around them. And deliver to families who have additional or complex needs but do not require a child protection response. I remember the third one. The third one can be around, parenting and positive parenting. So you could have the public health nurse coming on a Monday and saying, do this to manage the child's behaviour. You have someone else coming in the next day, no, don't do that, do this, right? So inconsistency in the messages from the support people that are working with the family. And delivered to families who have additional or complex needs but do not require a child protection response, which is nice and neatly packaged. But one thing I'm finding out is consensus on the difference between families who have complex needs but do not require a child protection response is not a simple issue. Different people have different views on that. And often that can become the source of tension in these interface boundaries that we're talking about, where perhaps a social worker is saying this does not require an assessment from us, and a community-based practitioner, whoever it might be, who's made the referral, feels that it does. And how do you actually resolve that, and how do you prevent it leading to bad relationships where people just bang heads and families get bounced back and forth over that boundary? The distinctions I would make we would make between the I and LANS is the LANS initiative was, interestingly, an explicit initiative of what was then called Children's Services Committees, what we now call Children and Young People Services Committees, but then was in its infancy, but now has been rolled out nationwide. So this is a government-led idea that the main statutory bodies and their community and voluntary partners must collaborate locally to deliver an integrated response at the management and strategic level to children and families in their area. Again, I'm not saying that's working perfectly, but that is an official government policy, that every county has a Children and Young People Services Committee, or every local authority area has a Children and Young People Services Committee, where the main managers from the key statutory agencies are supposed to work together to think about how they can deliver services in an integrated fashion. The LANS coordinator was based in the HSC, so a statutory body where then Child Protection and Welfare Services were based, whereas the ION, the Identification and Need coordinator in Sligo, was based in Sligo Social Services, which was one of these church-based organisations set up in the 70s to do generic social services. So it had that more community-based feel. The ION was strictly parent-led, whereas the LANS allowed for a greater role of the lead professional. I suppose we don't have time to go into huge detail on the nuanced differences that was, but the ION was really very strictly a co-production between the parent and the lead practitioner, whereas the Limerick model arguably was a bit more business as usual in allowing the lead to rest more with the professional. Okay? Obviously that might vary from intervention to intervention depending on the practice of an individual, but at the policy level that was a key distinction between the two. The LANS embraced the notion of common assessment framework, so I think language is really interesting in some of these things, whereas the ION, and there was a lot of debates about language when we went to mainstream this, whereas the ION used a similar framework but emphasised it is an identification of need by the parent rather than a formal assessment. So you could take, broadly speaking, the same framework, and one initiative is saying this is our assessment framework, and assessment being arguably a professional term, and the other initiative saying, we know this is an assessment framework, but we're not actually going to use it to do a professional assessment. We're going to use it to empower the parent to identify their child's needs, not using the language of assessment. Okay, so I know that's a nuanced distinction, as the then manager, now retired in the area that didn't use the term assessment, said, you can have different tools. The car jack thing or the car wrench is a tool, and you can use it to take the tyre off the car, or you can use it to hit somebody over the head. So you can use a tool in two different ways. And they were very strict in Sligo about using the tool to empower the parent to identify their child's needs, and indeed the child as well to participate in that.
That's your slide.
I know. I think this is my last one. So discussion and analysis, a series of interrelated. Really, we did a thematic analysis of those reports, okay, and felt that a lot of the qualitative findings from them, and they were small scale we're not overstating these pieces of research. They're small scale, broadly qualitative evaluation studies. But often what came up is roles, relationships, and structures in each of these sites. Thresholds and assessment, that goes back to that bit I said about let's not presume that there's consensus necessarily about what needs a child protection assessment and what doesn't, or whatever it might be. Joint working and information sharing and how permissive the system is of that. Capacity building, that often I get a bit frustrated with expectations, I suppose, of senior management or even at government level that we can somehow implement this way of working in the morning. So we've come off the back of at least 20 or 30 years of working in a particular type of way, a siloed way in my view, and now we want to work a different way. There's a capacity building in that. So for example, from TUSLA's point of view, if you want some of our funded partners who work with us to participate in a model like this, there's a capacity building thing to be done there with them. Because and it's interesting to see different cohorts of professionals, and I'm not going to get into kind of comparing, but like different cohorts of professionals take to using pre-social work, a common approach to identifying need, different to others. So some are quite resistant to it. I would never ask a parent, questions about how late they let their little Johnny stay out at night, or his health and how it's developing, or whatever it might be. That's none of my concern. That's not my role or job. So another professional would be quite comfortable doing that, and they always would have done that. Now you're just putting a framework on it for them. And resourcing is often a source of debate, but not in a simplistic fashion of complaining that we don't have enough resources, which obviously is something that we have all collectively felt coming out of a period of recession in this country, or people would argue whether we're coming out of it or not, or whatever. But it's not as simple as that. It's about what you use your resources to do. So if you agree that your resources are X, you'd like them to be X plus Y, but if you agree with them that they're X, collectively as a partnership of professionals and practitioners and indeed families in an area, how are you going to collectively decide how best to use them? And how are you going to, and I've been having conversations the last few days with managers within TUSLA around the country about how you're going to move, or do you even want to move from a situation where you're spending a lot of your resources, both financial and human, on dealing and responding to referred instances of abuse and neglect, to preventing families and supporting families and preventing instances of abuse and neglect. And I'm not arguing, both have appeal and both have merit, and I'm not saying it's a simple way to decide how to do that. It's a challenging way, but I think we need to begin having that conversation. I think maybe over the last 20 years in Ireland anyway, we weren't really having that conversation. We're just reacting. Okay. That's me done. Sorry, Anne, if I took too long.
That's okay, Fergal. Thanks for taking on Caroline's part. Okay, so I suppose an answer to that question the framework that kind of Fergal has put in there around the balance between early intervention, or do you put your money and your resources of time, people, into child protection and kind of later interventions. A programme was developed in between NUI Galway, the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre, and TUSLA to kind of mainstream the LANs and the ION models, and kind of build on all the work that had been done in kind of local areas around introducing more of an early intervention framework and emphasis within TUSLA's work. So the solution to this was the Programme for Prevention, Partnership and Family Support, which was funded by Atlantic Philanthropy over the next 3 years. Am I right, Fergal?
Yep.
Okay, so within this then there's 5 streams. So the first one is the Child and Family Support Networks and MEL, and I'll be particularly talking about MEL today. Then the next one is about public awareness, public education or awareness. So this is about trying to increase the level of awareness amongst the general public around sources of help, kind of formal and informal source of help. And also we're trying to understand where do people actually access help when they have issues within their own family. Third stream then is around commissioning and looking at how are kind of on a national level and at an area level, how are services being commissioned, and at what level of within kind of the Hardiker model of level 1, 2, 3 or 4, what levels are services being commissioned at. The fourth one is their parenting support and participation, which my colleague Nuala Connolly will be touching on this afternoon in her talk. So that's around looking at supporting parental involvement and participation, not just kind of at a consultative level, but in everyday decision making around their own children. And then the last one is around participation, which is around involving young people, children and young people to a greater degree in decisions. Again, at that kind of consultative level, but also in a sort of more participative way around decisions that are being made about their own lives. So, within this, the particular stream that we're interested in looking at in terms of this interface between the formal and the informal is the MEL model, which was developed as kind of almost like a nationwide rollout of the, I suppose, mainly the ION model up in Sligo. So the MEL model is basically a holistic approach to children in need of support who do not meet the criteria for child protection intervention. So the aim here is that instead of, as Ferg was saying, that you have the public health nurse and then some like speech and language therapists and all these different people beating a path to a door individually, that you're trying to bring a team around a child and actually have one kind of cohesive, coherent response so that you actually have a coordinated team approach to dealing with children's issues. So here as well, what's really important within the MEL model of this is around the kind of emphasis is on the process being led by the family and particularly by the parent and the young person themselves. So there's, and also then around bringing together all these different services to work with the child. So that could be, as I said, it could be anybody from an education welfare officer or or a principal or the teacher to the local sports coach. So that's kind of the aim around this. And I suppose coming in here is this idea that I suppose where the MEL model fits within that interface between the formal and informal is in some ways it's about kind of formalizing the informal so that it's kind of using the relationships that young people and families have access to already, particularly around the lead practitioner, because the lead practitioner is supposed to be somebody that has already had contact and built up a relationship with the child and family themselves. So that's where that kind of informal relationship that has already been developed for that person is put on a more formal footing in terms of that they actually, if they want to actually reach out and get more people on board, that they actually have this formal system of saying, well, I'm organising a MEL for Johnny, will you come on board and help out? So it is kind of giving them more of a kind of almost formal, not power wouldn't be the right word, formal clout in getting people to come on and help them. And also then it's sort of informalising the formal, because those kind of the formal services that a child or a family would usually meet in terms of, say, family support worker or an education welfare officer, it kind of informalises that relationship because there's supposed to be a more of a team approach and a relationship built between the family and the services being provided. So it's less about I'm coming in here to deliver help or her service to you. It's more supposed to be about the family are actually taking an active and equal part in the service themselves, in what's happening themselves. And so within that is this idea of the temporary team of TUSLA and external staff is created to help identify and meet a child's unmet needs. I should also point out, and I know this is somewhat of a source of issues at the moment, is that in lots of ways MEL, because I suppose for anyone who's grown up in Ireland, particularly rural Ireland, MEL is around that idea of people coming together at, like, say, harvest times and working together as a team. But I suppose one thing that needs to be remembered about MEL is that it's about trying to kind of minimum intervention, so that if you don't feel that you need to have this huge big team around the child, if a need can be met at an early stage by the intervention of one agency or two agencies, then you don't have to go to that kind of extreme. But I suppose part of the idea then about kind of emphasising that MEL is starting from the introduction of these documents is that hopefully that you'll be using those principles of consent by the family and involvement and participation by children, young people and their parents. So that hopefully those principles, the kind of MEL type principles, will actually feed through these processes. I'm okay, Fergal, am I getting it right so far? Mm-hmm. Am I getting it right so far?
You're doing great.
Thank you. So I suppose within that, the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre, we have a kind of a slightly different role in where, although we have an evaluative part of our process, of our involvement with the rollout of the PPFS and particularly the MEL programme. We also have a kind of more of a technical supportive role, so it's a collaboration, so that while we do that independent evaluation, we also have a responsibility and role in making sure that within the lifetime of our involvement, that TUSLA kind of puts in place sort of sustainable evaluation systems and monitoring systems around things like model fidelity. So we have this explicit remit, as I said, to provide the formative and summative feedback on the progress of the programme. So, for example, at the moment I'm working on an implementation case study on four different TUSLA areas, and I'll be feeding back obviously around how the process of implementation is taking place and any challenges and learning that can come out of that for TUSLA. I actually had the first meeting last week where I fed back to the 4 regional implementation managers about that. And we also have this technical support to TUSLA to embed evaluation to the programme of work. So I suppose what we can do here is that we can help to prevent that standardisation of service delivery being moved into more homogenisation, so that you actually meet the needs of the individual child rather than trying to fit the child to a particular system. So that's kind of a big part of our role there. As I said, at the moment I'm working on a model fidelity tool which TUSLA would be able to use and their partners in order to ensure that they're actually staying faithful to the very basic principles of consent and participation within this process. So said, this is here. So this is some of the ways that we can help to maintain that balance between standardisation and homogenisation. So analysing TUSLA's activities through this lens, as I said, that's a big part of the work that I'm doing at the moment in regards to this. Creating tools such as self-reflection frameworks and model fidelity tools, and then looking to ensure that these local experiences feed into the national implementation plan. So how do people that are working on the ground with this, how does that actually feed back up into the rollout of the national service model? So in that way, then you can hopefully balance between that standardisation that's coming from the national level and preventing the homogenisation through actually involving local deliverers of services and parents and families to get involved. And also so that you can, part of this as well, that we can document the process so that the learning is both ongoing and future orientated, so that hopefully when the Atlantic Philanthropy funding is ended in 3 years, the end of 2017, that this will have been embedded within TUSLA work practices. Okay, and finally back to our critical questions. Maybe Caroline came up with these as well, I think, so they're probably quite complex. So, finally, just some critical questions to consider when you're thinking about this kind of interface between formal and informal. So first of all, what's really important to think about here is our rights and justice to the forefront. So whatever model that you do develop and whatever way that you do interface these formal and informal help systems, that the rights and justice are to the forefront. Second one here is, are we sufficiently critically aware of the tension between extending the power of informal community family support and allowing the state to abdicate its responsibility and minimise its expenditure? I mean, one thing that's coming through in my research is definitely there's a big concern within community and voluntary sector around this idea that in instituting a model where a lot of the help and support comes from within the community and voluntary sector, then that government agencies will be able to say, well, it's your responsibility to deal with this now, rather than actually taking an active and ongoing role in that. A third point here is around the public have sufficient awareness of the formal services to be able to engage meaningfully in an authentic, participative manner. So are they actually aware that these formal services are out there, so that when they actually have a crisis in their family or need some help, that they actually know how to access them, and also that they can really participate in an authentic way, that they're not just receiving support, that they're actually actors in their own lives. The fourth point here is then, how do we maximise or harness the potential of the informal, that families and children even the worst circumstance, most people do have access to some kind of informal support system. So how do you actually maximise that within their lives in kind of a long-term sustainable way? And then the last point here is about what about resources to facilitate this through funding and commissioning? Will will TUSLA and other government bodies, because it does have to come from the likes of the HSE as well, will they actually facilitate this facilitate the rollout of this kind of MEL model, and particularly, in terms of that interface between the formal and informal, through not only resources, financial resources, but also in terms of actually releasing their staff to do it. So that's where it has to kind of involve more than just TUSLA, but also other statutory bodies like the HSE. Will they actually release their staff to take part in something like a MEL model? And so that is it. I think that's the last slide. Yes.